In the spring of 1883, two children arrived at the Bonaventure Institute for the Feeble-Minded, tucked beneath the overgrowth of Spanish moss and burial shadows along the Wilmington River. Their presence, documented in hospital records and gossip columns alike, would later become the subject of missing pages, redacted files, and inexplicable silences. To the townsfolk of Savannah, they were the Mirror Twins, girls who spoke in synchronized whispers and blinked in unison. But within the limestone halls of Bonaventure, they were something else entirely. Whatever they were meant to be, medical marvels, mistakes of nature, or reflections of something far worse, they didn't belong, and neither did those who tried to understand them. Founded in 1851, the Bonaventure Institute for the Feeble-Minded was one of the earliest facilities in the southern United States dedicated to what it called the correction of inferior minds. Occupying what was once a private plantation, the institution boasted sprawling grounds, a rigid educational curriculum, and a governing board drawn from Savannah's wealthiest families. Publicly praised for its modern methods and humane philosophies, Bonaventure positioned itself as a haven of progressive medicine, a place where science, morality, and charity could intersect. Advertisements in regional newspapers showed children at play, instructors leading literacy drills, and well-dressed staff attending to patients with dignity. But behind the placid veneer was an institution shaped by coercion, racial exclusion, and experimental treatments the public never saw. By 1883, the Institute had become a quiet repository for cases too complicated for city doctors and too inconvenient for polite society. The institution's reputation, the iron gates of Bonaventure Institute, bore the initials BIF, etched into a sandstone crest, flanked by two crumbling cherubs, whose faces had been worn down to smooth anonymity by decades of rain and heat. Once a plantation estate known for its rice fields and slave labor, the grounds had been repurposed following emancipation into a sanctuary for children deemed unfit for civil function. This transition was neither accidental nor revolutionary, it was economic. After the war, landholders without labor sought profit wherever it might bloom from the dust of lost privilege. In Bonaventure's case, it came from the minds of broken children. Dr. Winthrop Clay was the architect of this reinvention, an ambitious surgeon from Massachusetts who had relocated to Savannah during Reconstruction. Clay brought with him the rhetoric of reform and the gaze of pseudoscience. In his lectures, he spoke of cognitive degeneration as both a disease and a danger to the Republic. To the plantation elite desperate to retain control under a new racial order, Clay's ideas were not only appealing, they were actionable. By 1870, Bonaventure housed over 70 children between the ages of 6 and 14. Some were the offspring of freedmen accused of neglect. Others were poor white children deemed incorrigible by schoolmasters. None had any real choice in their residency. Commitment papers, often signed by overburdened mothers or clergymen, sealed them into the system without trial. Clay's justification was clinical. Each child here is either a threat to future productivity or a burden on present resources, he wrote in a pamphlet distributed to potential donors. We do not punish them. We prepare them for lives of limited usefulness. The daily rhythms of the Institute were unforgiving. Children rose at 5, washed in cold rainwater, and ate bread with syrup before being marched into application classes. These sessions were not academic in the traditional sense. Rather, they trained behavior, standing silently for long periods, completing repetitive tasks without complaint, memorizing hymns and reciting them without deviation. Rewards were meager, an extra spoon of beans at supper, a moment to play in the gravel lot. Punishments, on the other hand, were both psychological and physical. Mrs. Eunice Featherstone, the Institute's lead disciplinarian, was notorious even among the other staff. She kept a drawer of thin willow rods beside her desk and used them liberally. Her quarters also held what children referred to as the drawer, a narrow wooden box, just large enough to contain a child curled into themselves. Official documents described it as a sensory deprivation unit for agitation management. In practice, it was a tool for silence. Despite these cruelties, Bonaventure thrived in the public eye. Monthly visitors, journalists, physicians, clergy, were treated to scripted tours. The children selected to appear were carefully chosen for their docility and whiteness. They wore clean smocks. They performed songs. Photographs taken during these visits were published in periodicals and used to raise funds from philanthropists in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. Yet for all its curated elegance, Bonaventure suffered from an internal instability. Staff turnover was high. Those who stayed long enough began to report nightmares, weight loss, and frequent illnesses. Whispers among orderlies hinted at something else, not ghosts or curses, but patterns. Children disappearing from rolls without explanation, patient charts rewritten in new handwriting, locks changed without notice. In January 1883, 2 new entries appeared in the intake ledger, written in the clipped script of Dr. Clay himself. Ida May Heron, Eliza Ruth Heron, age 9, identical, admitted from Augusta, mother deceased, father unknown. Nothing else followed. No prior schooling, no indication of cognitive impairment. Their photos, taken on the day of arrival, showed 2 girls with thin faces and vacant expressions, dressed in matching calico frocks. Unlike most new patients, the twins did not cry. Dr. Clay kept the girls close. Within a week of their arrival, he reassigned them to private quarters near the administrative wing, bypassing the standard dormitories. Staff were instructed not to speak to them without permission. Medical evaluations were conducted in secret. On the surface, this favoritism seemed uncharacteristic, but Clay had long viewed the institute as his laboratory, and the twins, it seemed, were his latest hypothesis. Rumors bloomed quickly. Some believed the girls were foreign, perhaps part of a traveling exhibition abandoned in Savannah. Others insisted they were the children of a Union officer who had seduced a local woman and fled north. What few suspected, at least then, was that the mystery surrounding the twins was not about who they were, but what had already happened to them before they arrived. Records show the girls did not attend group classes. Instead, they were seen walking the perimeter paths in exact synchrony, hands always clasped together. One staff nurse, Magda Kinnard, noted in her private journal, "They do not speak in the morning, but by evening they sing to each other in tones I cannot describe, like hearing a hymn in reverse." Other staff described feeling inexplicably cold when standing near them, or of forgetting what they had come into a room to do if the twins were present. At the time, these sensations were dismissed as coincidence or exhaustion. The public, of course, knew nothing of this. In spring, a new article was published in the Savannah Republican, extolling the Institute's advances in mental calibration. It included a photograph of 6 smiling children seated on a bench beneath a flowering dogwood tree. The twins were not among them. They never would be. What follows is not found in published journals or archived correspondence. It comes from scraps, torn pages from diaries, a letter intercepted by a porter, an unsigned note passed to a departing nurse. Piecing these together reveals a version of Bonaventure's history that its benefactors never intended to be known. Aguntar Au Chat GPT, the first to raise concerns, was Dr. Julian Mercer, a junior physician recently transferred from Charleston. He arrived at Bonaventure in February of 1883, 2 weeks after the Heron twins' intake. In letters to his sister, preserved only through copies made by a local librarian decades later, Dr. Mercer expressed initial admiration for the Institute's orderliness and discipline. "The children are quiet, clean, and remarkably compliant," he wrote in one letter. "Even the colored wards are neat. Dr. Clay's methods, while rigid, seem to yield results." But that tone changed quickly. Within his first month, Mercer began to question Clay's practices. He noted the absence of documented diagnoses for nearly a third of the patient population. More troubling was the lack of transparency surrounding the twins. They were not listed on any of the standard patient rosters, and when Mercer attempted to access their charts, he was told by Mrs. Featherstone that, "Those girls are under Dr. Clay's direct supervision. You needn't trouble yourself." But Mercer was not easily deterred. Curious and increasingly unsettled, he began observing the girls during their supervised outdoor walks. What he saw disturbed him. Their steps were always synchronized, not merely similar but mirrored, the left foot of one always matching the right of the other. They turned corners together, blinked together, paused in identical rhythm. He described the phenomenon as mechanical, rehearsed, like watching two dancers forced to share the same pulse. When he attempted to speak to one of them, Ida, he believed, she tilted her head slightly and Eliza did the same. Neither responded. Both stared through him. Afterward, he found that his pocket watch, normally reliable, was off by several minutes, though he could not explain why. He dismissed it as coincidence. By late March, Mercer's inquiries began to attract notice. He was summoned to Clay's office and reprimanded for overstepping his station. Clay was calm but firm, assuring Mercer that the twins were receiving advanced calibration treatment not suitable for general review. Mercer, though skeptical, agreed to redirect his focus. Outwardly, he complied. Privately, he began keeping notes. Those notes, later recovered from a false bottom drawer in his desk, detailed strange occurrences. Clay's office door, usually locked, found ajar on 3 occasions. Strange sounds in the West Wing, humming, high and sustained, without an identifiable source. A nurse named Lydia Thorne collapsed during a night shift and was dismissed for hysteria, though Mercer's notes suggest she had been found murmuring fragments of a song in a language no one recognized. He described one child, not the twins, who had reportedly bitten off part of his own tongue and was later moved to the underground infirmary. No reason was recorded. In early April, Mercer finally gained access to a portion of the twins' medical files. What he found was troubling. There were no birth certificates, no family records. The only document was a letter of transfer from a facility in Augusta, unsigned and bearing no official seal. The letter referenced a failure of separation and urged absolute containment. This was not standard language for any known medical classification. Meanwhile, the twins' behavior became increasingly erratic. Several orderlies refused to escort them outdoors. They complained of disorientation, nosebleeds, and a sense of being unmade when near the girls. One attendant, a young man named Silas Jernigan, resigned abruptly and later died by suicide. His note read only, "They see each other inside." Clay responded by increasing the twins' isolation. Their room was reinforced. A mirror in the hallway outside was removed after a matron reported seeing 4 girls where there should have been 2. Staff were instructed to refer to the twins only by their assigned numbers, patient 43A and 43B. This, Clay believed, would reduce confusion. Others saw it as an attempt to erase what little identity the girls still possessed. Among the staff, a silent unease began to settle. Meals were missed. Conversations became hushed. Those who had once praised Bonaventure's orderliness now avoided its West Wing altogether. Mercer, too, began to change. His letters grew frantic. He complained of insomnia, migraines, and visual disturbances. "I see them in dreams," he wrote. "They walk backwards through corridors that do not exist. They call to each other without moving their lips." In a final letter to his sister, dated April 19, 1883, Mercer wrote, "I do not believe this is illness. Not in any conventional sense. It is as if the Institute itself is misaligned. The more I study them, the more I feel the walls bending inward. Dr. Clay does not see it. Or he does and refuses to admit it." 2 days later, Dr. Julian Mercer was found dead in the woods behind the property. The cause was listed as exposure, though temperatures that night had been mild. His body showed signs of severe dehydration and bruising around the temples. His final notes were confiscated. The Institute made no public acknowledgement of his death. On May 3rd, a traveling inspection board arrived unannounced. It was part of a statewide initiative to evaluate educational and medical facilities. Bonaventure had been selected randomly. Clay, caught off guard, attempted to stall their review, but was forced to comply. Inspectors were shown the usual tour, classrooms, dormitories, gardens, but were barred from the West Wing, which was said to be under quarantine for a mumps outbreak. One inspector, a schoolteacher named Nadine Brock, later wrote in her diary, "The place felt wrong, like standing in a theater where everyone has forgotten their lines. The children smiled too long, the staff blinked too little, and there was a sound, not quite singing, but something trying to be. The report filed with the State Board was largely favorable. Small infractions were noted. outdated plumbing, inadequate lighting, but nothing to warrant further inquiry. Bonaventure remained operational. By June, the twins were no longer seen on the grounds. Staff claimed they had been transferred to a facility in Virginia. No such record was ever found. Their room was emptied, scrubbed, and reassigned to a new patient within days. Clay, in a letter to the Board of Trustees, referred to the girls as a completed experiment, but others remembered. Nurse Magda Kinnard left the institute later that year and relocated to Atlanta. She never spoke publicly about her time at Bonaventure, but her letters, passed down to a niece and preserved in a private archive, tell a different story. "They were not mirrors," she wrote. "They were windows. Not into the soul. That would be poetry. No, into something unfinished, something that did not belong here. Ignored signs will follow. Would you like me to?" Ignored signs. The summer of 1883 came hot and heavy in Savannah. The oak branches sagged under the weight of heat and mildew. And at Bonaventure, the air inside the main ward thickened with something that wasn't just weather. The twins were gone. Or at least that was the official line. But to the night staff, to the orderlies who scrubbed floors past midnight and changed linens after the doors were locked, Ida and Eliza Heron had never left. Their beds had been stripped, yes. Their belongings cleared. Their names erased from all rosters. And yet, more than one matron reported finding small, identical footprints pressed into the dust of the hallway floors, spaced evenly, side by side. Records from that season show a spike in staff illnesses and patient disturbances. 3 children were removed to a private hospital in Augusta after developing what was described as severe temporal disorientation. When questioned by the attending nurse, one child, 8-year-old Thomas Eldin, simply repeated, "They keep starting over, they keep starting over." Another child, 15-year-old Annabeth Crane, refused to speak for 2 weeks, following a supposed fall down the infirmary stairs. She was later documented writing the same phrase in chalk on her bed frame. Mirror doesn't lie. Behind closed doors, senior staff were becoming divided. Dr. Clay, ever the empiricist, refused to acknowledge any correlation between the twins and the rising disturbances. In a memo to the board dated July 9th, he wrote, "The lingering fixation on patients 43A and 43B is symptomatic of a broader problem of superstition among junior staff. We must remember that our mission is medical, not mystical, and certainly not sentimental." His tone only deepened resentment. By then, Clay's authority was no longer absolute. Eunice Featherstone, once his most loyal enforcer, had begun to question his judgment. In a letter she attempted to send, later intercepted by Clay's office, she described unexplainable incidents, erratic behavior among girls in Ward 3, and an auditory recurrence near the West Wing that seems to mimic the cadence of Dr. Mercer's final recorded entry. Featherstone had begun secretly compiling statements from staff who'd witnessed what she referred to as echo phenomena. Sounds heard in perfect reverse, or seen movements that repeated seconds after the original had occurred. Even more unsettling were the mirror incidents. After the removal of the hallway mirror near the twins' room, other reflective surfaces across the institute began to feature in reports. Their dormitory washbasin reportedly showed 2 faces brushing hair in tandem, despite only one girl standing at the sink. A boy in ward, one screamed when he caught sight of himself in a tin serving tray and could not be calmed for hours. In each case, the reflection did not mimic, it delayed or anticipated. Mrs. Featherstone, increasingly isolated, began documenting these anomalies in a ledger hidden beneath the floorboards of her quarters. It was never officially found, but portions were transcribed decades later from pages passed between staff. One entry reads, "I do not believe they left. I believe they fractured. We sent away the bodies, perhaps. But what stayed is the interval, the space between them, and its learning. Other staff left entirely. Over a dozen resigned between July and September of that year, citing health concerns, family obligations, or emotional fatigue. Among those who remained, many adopted small irrational habits, covering mirrors with cloth, refusing to walk west of the administrative hall, avoiding synchronized actions during shifts, such as lifting trays or turning corners at the same moment. The patients, meanwhile, suffered quietly. One child, Harriet V., age 10, stopped speaking altogether and began drawing intricate patterns of overlapping circles in every available surface: paper, wood, even the inside of her sleeves. Dr. Clay dismissed it as repetitive cognitive dissonance. Featherstone, however, copied several of the designs into her ledger, noting that they seemed topographical, almost like maps. Only one child, a boy named Reuben Conway, age 13, was able to speak at length about what he had seen. He had never interacted directly with the twins, but had often watched them through the cracked door to the garden path. In a whispered conversation with Nurse Agnes Moore, he claimed the girls spoke in cracks, a phrase that made no immediate sense until Moore asked him to explain. Not words, not noises, the in-between. When you close a book too fast and the pages slap, that sound, like that. Agnes Moore, a recent graduate of the Savannah Training School for Nurses, recorded the conversation in her pocket diary and began watching The West Wing herself. What she saw, she later claimed, wasn't the twins but the outline of them, as if someone had drawn their shape in dust and forgot to finish. Moore attempted to organize a meeting of concerned staff, but Clay intervened, labeling her behavior as disruptive. She was reassigned to the boys' ward and warned against inciting paranoia. Within a week, she was gone, sent to a sanatorium in North Carolina for exhaustion and female hysteria. Her belongings were boxed, her letters returned. No further mention was made of her during her time at Bonaventure. By late August, the Institute's rhythms had changed. The bell for evening prayer began ringing a minute early or a minute late, never consistently. The meal carts arrived out of sequence. Doors that had always opened inward now resisted or opened the wrong way. These were minor glitches, easily ignored on paper. But to those living within Bonaventure's walls, it felt like the building itself had begun to slip. Not collapse, but realign. Dr. Clay refused to engage. To him, any deviation was a result of poor discipline or lax routine. He scheduled new drills for the children, extending their silent standing hours and introducing a new chant meant to reassert temporal control. This chant, 12 syllables long, was recited every morning under the guidance of Mrs. Featherstone. It was designed to reinforce order. But the effect, according to the children's reactions, was the opposite. Shortly after the chants began, two of the older girls in Ward 4, Connie and Alma Fletcher, were found sitting upright in their beds, with identical scratches running horizontally across their necks. They were unresponsive but breathing. When later questioned, they simply said, "Not the same, not the same, not the same." Featherstone begged Clay to suspend the ritual. He refused. "We do not yield to phantoms," he reportedly said. "This is a place of science." But by September 1st, even Clay had begun to falter. His notes, once clinical and verbose, became terse. Jagged. One entry, preserved by a clerk who feared its destruction, reads, "Mirror cracked, not broken. Repetition is not reflection, they are practicing." The final incident of that season was not violent, but definitive. During a routine head count, 4 children were found outside their rooms, seated in the garden where the twins had once walked. They were barefoot, mouths closed, eyes shut, but mouthing the same word again and again, 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 again. No one could determine how they had left their locked rooms. Clay, in what would be his last known directive, ordered the garden path sealed. Fences were erected, the hedges trimmed back. The gate locked and welded. The twins' names, once etched into the interior intake roster, were scratched out with such force that the wood splintered, but nothing truly left. Not the feeling, not the pattern, not the sense that somewhere, just beyond the line of vision, 2 sets of eyes were still watching, waiting to be noticed. Not ghosts, not memories. Something else. The official story was that Bonaventure had entered a restorative phase. In newsletters sent to donors in Savannah and Charleston, Dr. Clay spoke of seasonal illnesses, minor restructuring, and a recommitment to harmony and discipline. The twins were never mentioned. Neither was the string of resignations that followed the garden incident. 5 staff members left in a single week, including matron Cecile Riley, who had served at the Institute for nearly 15 years. Her only remark upon leaving, recorded by the groundskeeper, was, "They aren't gone, they're just deeper now." The most telling silence, however, came from Eunice Featherstone. Once the unshakable pillar of Clay's operation, she stopped attending staff briefings and was often found pacing the empty classrooms. Scribbling notes in a red-covered booklet she never let out of her sight. She refused to speak of the twins aloud, but wrote the word mirrored dozens of times across ledger margins, patient forms, even her own palms. Eventually she stopped speaking altogether. Children, especially those who had been present before the twins' arrival, began to internalize a new set of rules, ones not written in Clay's manuals or enforced by Featherstone's rods. They avoided stepping on cracks between floorboards. They blinked deliberately once with each eye. They spoke to their reflections softly when they thought no one was listening. The rituals weren't taught, but they spread like flu, one girl copying another, a boy whispering what he had seen behind the washroom door to his bunkmate. This knowledge passed invisibly, wordlessly beneath the veneer of normalcy. And still, Clay refused to break. If anything, his control hardened. Children were made to recite the chant at increased intervals. The lines of their uniforms were checked with ruler precision. Meal times were reduced by exactly 90 seconds. He called this recalibration. But beneath the structure was desperation, and beneath that something more fragile. On October 3rd, Clay called an emergency assembly. All staff and available children were gathered in the refectory. His speech, intended to restore order, began confidently enough, reminders of duty, mission, the promise of science. But midway through, his language changed. He stuttered, repeated phrases, and then, most chillingly, began speaking in mirrored syntax, entire sentences spoken backward, not in word order but syllabically reversed. Recordings don't exist. But several staff members later documented what they heard as phonetic palindromes, words that looped onto themselves, erasing their own meaning as they formed. The assembly was dismissed in silence. Clay retired to his quarters and was not seen for 4 days. In his absence, Featherstone took control, but her rule was not one of command. It was passive, watching. She no longer disciplined the children. She simply observed them, jotting furiously in her red notebook, tracing their movements as though mapping constellations. Staff were given less instruction. Daily routines loosened. The sense of slipping intensified. Then, on October 11th, Nurse Althea Benson was found unconscious near the sealed garden path. She had no visible injuries, but her hair had turned almost completely white. When revived, she could not speak. Not from trauma, but because, as the Institute doctor noted, her tongue was rigid, locked against the roof of her mouth. She died 3 days later from dehydration. After her death, Clay re-emerged, thinner, paler, but with an eerie calm. He ordered the red notebook confiscated and Featherstone removed from duty. She was placed in a private room on the 3rd floor, under sedation. According to one orderly, Clay whispered to her as she was taken upstairs, "You followed the rhythm too closely. They caught you counting." The removal of Featherstone marked the final collapse of internal coherence. What remained of the staff operated under bare minimums. Lessons ceased. Application drills were abandoned. Children were no longer corrected for speaking out of turn or drawing on walls. Even the chant, once the spine of daily life, fell away. But the anomalies did not. In fact, they intensified. More children were found outside their rooms without explanation. They claimed to have walked through walls that forgot to be solid. One boy, Simon A., described seeing a room where everyone walked backward, including the birds outside the window. He drew the scene in chalk, rough figures identical in posture, heads turned the wrong way. At night, staff reported lights flickering in perfect synchrony across the west wing. One floor nurse described seeing the shadows of 2 girls dancing in perfect mirror formation along the corridor walls, even though no light source could have created the effect. When she tried to intervene, she lost consciousness for several minutes. Her shift partner found her lying on the tiles, with both her shoes removed and placed neatly side by side, a habit reportedly favored by the twins. By mid-November, Clay implemented what he termed the final measure. Patient populations were redistributed, the West Wing was sealed, windows painted over. all reflective surfaces removed. He suspended family visitations indefinitely. The official reason was outbreak control. Behind that justification was fear. In what appears to have been a last-ditch effort to reassert scientific authority, Clay drafted a 27-page treatise titled Reflections and Behavior, a case study in environmental mimicry among juveniles. Only the first 5 pages survive. They are coherent if alarmingly detached. In them, he outlines his belief that the twins suffered from a condition he called inter-identic distortion, a theory positing that when 2 genetically identical subjects are exposed to a rigid behavioral mirror environment, their neural feedback loops may collapse into recursive patterns. His final sentence reads, "In such cases, the mind becomes both subject and environment. It no longer behaves, it reenacts." Clay submitted the paper to the American Journal of Psychological Science. It was rejected without peer review. The editor reportedly noted, "Unfalsifiable, speculative, at times bordering on metaphysical." The response devastated Clay. His notes from that period grow sparse, irregular. One entry simply reads, "They were never mirrors, they were alignment, and we broke it." On December 2, 1883, a fire broke out in the storage wing of Bonaventure. It was extinguished before it reached the patient wards, but it served as a final rupture. Clay resigned the following day. Featherstone was sent to an institution in Macon. The children were dispersed to other facilities across the state. The twins were never publicly acknowledged again. Yet decades later, former patients, now adults, would occasionally reference Bonaventure in interviews and oral histories. They described memories of long silences, voices that didn't match mouths, and games that only made sense when played backward. One recalled, "There were 2 girls, always together, not touching, but close enough that if one moved, the other felt it. They didn't talk much. But when they looked at you, it was like they saw what you were going to do before you did. Horror uncovered will follow. Shall I?" Horror uncovered by 1884, Bonaventure Institute for the Feeble-Minded was a shell. Officially, it had not closed, not in any legal or procedural sense. Its charter remained valid. Its board of trustees still met quarterly, but the building was nearly empty. 2 groundskeepers stayed on to maintain the property, and a single nurse, Rebecca Kilgore, was tasked with sorting and archiving records for future review. She lived in the former boys' dormitory, cooked her own meals, and reported monthly to the Savannah Municipal Board with brief perfunctory updates. Structure sound, no new admissions, no incidents. Beneath that phrase, no incidents, she would sometimes draw a line, sometimes 2. Yet across the city, whispers resumed. Former staff scattered in new jobs and far-off towns wrote letters to each other in private, many of which would not surface until generations later. In them, one theme reappeared with eerie consistency. Something was still happening at Bonaventure, not in the wings that had been sealed, not in the halls filled with silence, but in the cracks between memory and history, in what people remembered but couldn't verify. The first documented breach occurred not within the Institute's walls, but in the files Rebecca Kilgore was ordered to consolidate. Among the patient records, she found a folder marked Incomplete Twins. Inside were 23 pages, most of them redacted, burned along the edges, or otherwise rendered illegible. But 2 remained intact. One was an early intake assessment, handwritten and signed not by Clay but by Dr. Julian Mercer. Patients exhibit synchronized ocular and muscular responses, not imitation, simultaneity, pulse rate identical, auditory processing mirrored, preliminary conclusion, shared stimulus response bypassing individual cognition. The second document was more disturbing, undated, unsigned, and titled only Instructions. It was addressed not to staff but to the twins themselves. You are to remain still when observed. Do not display difference unless signaled. You are to breathe in sequence. You are to correct each other silently. Any deviation will be marked as fracture. The reflection must be clean. Kilgore, alarmed, made copies of both documents and hid the originals inside the hollow of a wall behind the old staff dining hall. The copies she mailed, anonymously, to the Georgia Medical Review Board. They were never acknowledged. At the same time, across town, a man named Luther Pelham began compiling oral testimonies. He was a retired clerk who had lost a cousin during his time as a ward at Bonaventure. What began as a personal search grew into an informal archive. Over the course of 4 years, Pelham interviewed 19 former residents and 6 ex-staff members. Most refused to go on record. Some denied any knowledge, but others, particularly those who had been children during 1883, offered disturbing recollections. One boy, Harold S., remembered being locked in a closet overnight as punishment for crying during the chant. I heard someone humming through the wall, not from the hall and from behind the bricks. He believed it was the twins, though they had been gone for weeks by then. A girl named Miriam T., later institutionalized herself, drew dozens of portraits in charcoal and ink. All featured 2 girls standing on either side of a mirror. In most of the drawings, the reflection was wrong, the left hand raised in the mirror when the right was raised outside it. In some, the twins were not reflections of each other at all, but slightly different. Eyes closer set in one, hair parted on the wrong side, a scar appearing only in one face. Miriam called them the other girls. The most coherent account came from Cornelia Price, a former nurse who had been reassigned to a children's hospital in Atlanta after leaving Bonaventure. In a letter to Luther Pelham, she wrote, "They were not evil. But they weren't children, not like the others. They had something between them. Not affection, not even communication. It was as if they were pieces of a larger thing, each incomplete without the other, but dangerous when too close. We never understood what Clay thought he was doing, but he wanted to observe the break. He wanted to split them, and when he tried, everything changed." Rice insisted that the real rupture had occurred not in what the Institute did, but in how it looked at them. Not just the twins, but all children. We stopped seeing them as whole. We watched too long, measured too much. Eventually, the place began watching us back. As Pelham's archive grew, patterns emerged. Timelines overlapped, anomalies repeated. He constructed a crude diagram showing when each testimony mentioned mirroring, fracture, or repetition. The densest cluster was March through October 1883, the exact window of the twins' presence at Bonaventure. Yet the most disturbing revelation came in 1888, when a city engineer named Richard Hollins was contracted to survey the land beneath the Institute as part of a drainage upgrade. While excavating near the West Wing, his team uncovered a sealed sublevel previously undocumented on any blueprint. Inside were 7 small rooms. Padded, windowless, each fitted with a chair bolted to the floor and a single reflective surface. Some polished tin, others fragments of broken mirror mounted in wood. No names, no tags, no identifiers, only tally marks scratched into the walls. Hollins halted the excavation and filed a formal report. The city, under pressure from Bonaventure's trustees, declared the space an abandoned medical wing and ordered it resealed. Hollins resigned from municipal service 6 months later. In a letter to his brother, he wrote, "Those rooms weren't abandoned, they were unfinished." Elam attempted to reopen the investigation, but found himself stonewalled. His correspondence was ignored. His attempts to publish blocked. Local newspapers refused to print even a letter to the editor. Finally, in frustration, he self-published a small pamphlet in 1891 titled "The Rooms Beneath, an Inquiry into Bonaventure Institute." Only 20 copies were printed. Most were destroyed. One survives today in a private collection, its pages brittle but legible. In it, Pelham makes a chilling claim that Bonaventure did not suffer a single tragedy but many small ones, repetitions, rehearsals, experiments. That the twins were not anomalies, but indicators. They showed us something, not what lies beyond the mirror, but what happens when the mirror is asked to decide who is real. The pamphlet concludes with a plea, not for justice, but for recognition. We must remember them not as reflections or mysteries, but as consequences, not of science gone too far, but of humanity stretched too thin across its own ambitions. As for Bonaventure, it was eventually sold in 1902. The building was demolished, the land repurposed. A park now stands where the garden path once wound its silent route. No plaque marks the spot, No records remain in public archives. But every few years, park rangers report finding two small sets of footprints pressed into the grass, identical in size, perfectly parallel, always facing each other. The surviving traces of Bonaventure's past were never fully erased. Beneath the moss-draped canopy of Savannah's historic district, among archivists and amateur historians, the name still surfaced in whispers. Not as a place of horror in the traditional sense, but as a wound. An institutional lesion never cauterized, never truly closed. And the twins, Ida and Eliza Heron, were its echo. The mirror held up too long. In 1904, over 2 decades after the last official operation at Bonaventure, a former city surveyor named Caleb Norris came forward with maps. These were not the public survey documents filed with the municipal office, but private sketches. His brother had been part of the excavation crew in 1888, and Caleb had inherited a trunk of his belongings after his death. Among them were detailed layouts of the sub-level beneath Bonaventure's west wing. What shocked historians was not merely the presence of the sealed rooms, already suspected by Luther Pelham's pamphlet, but the discovery of a second corridor, narrower, lined with what Caleb labeled observation alcoves. These alcoves were staggered in sequence, each marked with initials, JM, EF, RKAM, known staff initials, not storage units, not maintenance closets. They had been built to watch, not the patients, but the rooms, and by extension, whatever the rooms contained. It was never clear whether the twins were placed in these chambers or whether the spaces were designed in response to their behavior. But one note scribbled in the margin of Caleb's sketch remained chillingly clear. Mirrored space, audio delay confirmed, do not make eye contact. Public release of these documents was quietly denied by the Savannah Historical Society. Lack of provenance, they claimed. Privately, 2 board members expressed concern over the implications. One noted in a letter, "If this is true, we weren't treating them. We were dissecting something we couldn't name." The question of what Bonaventure had attempted to do and failed lingered over every piece of rediscovered documentation. Across 3 separate psychiatric archives, references began appearing between 1905 and 1921 to a condition labeled duplicative affective dissociation. The phrase, clearly derivative of Clay's rejected theory, described a state in which the subject experiences shared emotion through a mirrored interlocutor. None of these papers cited Bonaventure directly, but handwriting analyses later showed at least one author had served briefly under Dr. Clay in 1882. Meanwhile, descendants of former patients began speaking more freely, though most refused to be recorded. Some described inherited habits that had no obvious origin, synchronized speech between siblings, compulsive symmetry in daily routines, avoidance of mirrors past sunset. One woman, Esther Crane, claimed her grandfather, a Bonaventure patient, would never allow reflections in the house after dark. He'd put towels over anything shiny, she said. He used to say, "If you can see yourself at night, something else might see you back." In 1928, a student at the Savannah College of Art and Design, Lucille Benton, wrote her thesis on institutional memory and spatial trauma. Her project, part sculpture and part installation, recreated one of the sealed rooms based on Pelham's pamphlet and oral accounts. She installed 2 chairs facing each other across a glass panel, and beneath each chair she placed a metronome ticking in inverse time. The piece caused a stir, not for its artistry, but for what happened during its exhibition. Over the course of 3 days, 7 students reported disorientation, headaches, and a sensation of hearing sound bounce inside their skull. One student fainted. The exhibit was closed. Benton was asked to remove the installation. In her private journal, she wrote, "They were there, not ghosts, not visions, just a presence, not gone, not ever gone, just waiting to be asked again." The idea that Bonaventure's experiment, whether scientific or existential, had somehow left a mark on those involved continued to circulate in closed academic circles. But no one dared publish. Not officially. Fear of professional ridicule, of being associated with mirror law, kept mouths shut and hands still. Yet in 1947, a single name re-emerged, Rebecca Kilgore. Now in her 80s, she had retired to a rural home outside Macon. Approached by a graduate student named Frank Hewson, who was compiling a thesis on forgotten asylums of the South, Kilgore agreed to speak, on the condition that her account remain unpublished until after her death. She passed in 1952. The transcript of her interview, locked away until 1968, provides perhaps the closest thing to an eyewitness testimony we possess. "They never left," she said of the twins. "Not truly, I don't mean in spirit, not ghosts, not that. I mean something stayed behind. The part of them that had learned how to be watched, the part that learned how to stay still, how to move only when you weren't looking." She described nights when doors opened without sound, when her own reflection in the glass of the archival cabinet would not match her movement. "They weren't haunting us," she insisted. "We had asked them to be more than they were, to copy, to mirror, to behave. We split them, and what stayed behind was the question we didn't know how to answer." By the late 20th century, Bonaventure had slipped into obscurity. The park built over its remains became a favorite of families and joggers. Few knew its history. A single oak tree, twisted and gnarled beyond its years, still stands near the edge of the old garden path. Children sometimes say they see shadows there, always in pairs, always facing each other. And in the archives of the Georgia State Hospital system, a restricted box remains unopened. It is marked Bonaventure Institute, 1883, duplicate files, access denied. Legacy and silence will follow. Shall I legacy and silence in 1973, a small group of graduate researchers at Emory University received partial clearance to review non-clinical documents from the state's forgotten mental institutions as part of a federally funded historical reconciliation program. Their intent was bureaucratic, to digitize paper records, cross-reference surnames, and establish baselines for long-term institutionalization trends. Bonaventure was not originally on their list. It entered their scope only after a misfiled crate arrived at the State Archive Office in Atlanta. Its contents bore the mark of a separate institution. BIF, Bonaventure Intake Files, 1881-1884. Inside, the folders were fragile but organized. Most were routine: logs of admissions, letters from distant relatives, behavior charts. But at the bottom of the stack, a thin manila envelope contained 3 small notebooks, each wrapped in cloth. 2 were signed by staff, Featherstone's red notebook and a smaller ledger attributed to Dr. Clay. The third had no name, no date. It was bound in brown paper, its pages covered with drawings. Not of the twins, not exactly. Instead, sketches of reflections, girls and boys standing before mirrors, their likenesses doing something different. A hand lifted on one side and still on the other, a mouth open, matched by silence. The team lead, Dr. Lena Hoffman, was disturbed by the drawings but intrigued by the annotations beneath them. Many were written phonetically, as though attempting to mimic sound. Others were fragments, phrases repeated with minor variation. No start, only again. They learn by waiting. We mirrored wrong. Do not say their names at the same time. Hoffman, initially skeptical, contacted a linguist to examine the notebooks. His conclusion was cautious but clear. Whoever wrote them had been engaged in a form of recursive cognition, documenting experience not as memory, but as repetition. "This is not a child's diary," he wrote. "This is a failed attempt to stop something from happening again." The significance of the notebooks reached beyond historical interest. Within weeks, the Emory team faced resistance. Requests for further materials were denied. Archives previously marked public access were reclassified. Hoffman, undeterred, submitted a proposal to publish a limited paper on reflexive behavioral architecture in pre-modern institutions. It was rejected by every journal she submitted to. No reason given. By the following year, her funding was pulled. The project was disbanded. Yet not all traces were lost. Hoffman made personal copies of every document she found. And in 1981, on the eve of retirement, she mailed a box to a former patient's grandson, a man named Samuel Price, a history teacher in Cobb County. She wrote only one note. "They didn't leave. They were moved. The question is, where to?" Rice did not reply. But he did preserve the materials, and in 1997, following his death, the box was donated to the Georgia Southern Historical Records Center. Once catalogued, it was labeled simply Bonaventure Archive Uncertain Origin. Its reappearance coincided with a slow resurgence in local folklore. Tour guides in Savannah began mentioning the institute again, not prominently and never officially, but in whispered asides. Stories of the mirrored girls, of nurses who vanished, of fires that left no ash. The narrative blurred, softened by time, twisted by the needs of storytelling. Yet beneath the embellishments, certain facts remained untouched. The twins, their silence, their departure, and the rooms beneath the garden. But perhaps the most haunting testimony came not from records, but from a woman named Florence Asher, who in 2003 contacted the Georgia Public Radio series Unspoken, a program that collected oral histories from marginalized communities. She claimed her grandmother had been a kitchen maid at Bonaventure in 1883. Her story, recorded in a single interview before her death, reframed the legacy of the institution in ways no historian had dared. They thought the danger was in what the girls could do, she said, but it was never them. It was the place. Bonaventure wasn't watching them. It was learning from them. They taught it how to see. Asher described nights when footsteps would echo through the halls in perfect mimicry, where doors would open before someone reached for them, where time slipped, not by hours, but by seconds. You'd say something, she explained, and then hear yourself say it again before you'd finished, like the building was practicing. When asked why her grandmother never spoke publicly, Asher simply replied, she knew better. She said some things don't like being remembered wrong, and that perhaps is the cruelest legacy of Bonaventure, not just the abuse, the secrecy, or the silence, but the way it ensured that even memory could not be trusted. Over the years, every attempt to fix the past in place, to say this happened here, then this, was quietly undone by the institution's peculiar gravity. Things slipped, names disappeared, reflections blurred. What was left was not a story but a rhythm, one that looped, faltered, and began again. And as one final mark of that rhythm, in 2011, during renovation of a municipal water line, city workers uncovered an iron plaque buried near the river, just outside the former grounds. It was badly rusted, words nearly illegible. After cleaning, the inscription read, 43A and 43B, still in sequence, not forgotten. The iron plaque found in 2011 was quietly removed. No official statement was made by the city, no photograph published in the paper. The plaque now resides in the private collection of a retired county engineer who has refused to disclose how he came into possession of it. Some things, he told a visiting reporter, are meant to stay unsaid, not because they're false, but because they repeat. The phrase, they repeat, has since become shorthand among a small community of Southern archivists and institutional historians who study suppressed or neglected facilities like Bonaventure. In meetings held off-record and online, they've tracked similar stories across multiple states. Twin admissions marked without parentage, wards sealed for realignment, records purged not due to fire or flood, but by deliberate redaction. But only Bonaventure contains the specific pattern: mirrored behavior, recursive architecture, sensory confusion. It is, in every document, a case not of haunting, but of precision broken loose from meaning. In 2015, a freelance filmmaker named Alma Jeffers attempted to produce a documentary on the twins. She secured interviews, recovered audio from the Unspoken project, and even obtained scans of the drawings from the Emery team. Her footage included long takes of the remaining foundations of Bonaventure's north wall and testimonies from two former hospital janitors who claimed to have visited the site in the 1950s when the garden fence still stood. They both remembered seeing a chair rock by itself in the middle of the yard, yet the film was never finished. During the editing process, Jeffers claimed that sections of audio had spontaneously reversed, not through data corruption, but through playback. Voices became jumbled. Lips moved out of sync with sound. The footage appeared normal when watched frame by frame, but produced a deep sense of nausea when allowed to run continuously. Eventually, she abandoned the project. In a personal blog post, now deleted, she wrote, "It doesn't want to be told. Not as a movie, not as a story. It wants to be remembered in parts, in pieces, in things that don't quite line up. What emerged instead was a new form of legacy, one that lived in patterns, rumors, and repetitions. Tourists in Savannah sometimes report odd sensations when walking along the east end of the Riverside Park, where Bonaventure once stood. Electronics flicker, photographs blur. Parents complain of children speaking in unison without intending to. A local artist painted a mural of Savannah's history and later removed it after viewers complained that the same girl appears twice, but slightly wrong. No one could prove it. No one had seen her paint it that way. And in the years since, no official history book has mentioned the Heron twins. Not in Georgia's education curriculum. Not in the State Museum's exhibit on 19th century institutions. Their names remain absent, yet for those who know, their presence is unmistakable. It lies in the unanswered letters archived in the Savannah Municipal Hall, inquiries from families who never heard back. It lives in the surviving chant, passed down in scattered fragments among the children who grew up in the shadow of the Institute, never knowing what the words meant, left to right, not side by side. Mirror holds what truth must hide. Speak as one or none at all, twice will come before the fall. In 2019, a podcast episode on unsolved institutional anomalies attempted to recount the story. It was abruptly removed 2 days after publication. Listeners reported issues while playing it, overlapping voices, repeated lines, and long silences filled only by faint breathing. The creators, when asked, refused to comment. They issued a brief apology and moved on to other topics. But in one archived version still available through a Mirror site, the final words are audible. We looked too long. We made the mirror look back. And so it ends not with an answer, not with a resolution, but with a rhythm, a beat that never lands. Bonaventure is gone, its walls replaced by grass and benches. But its echo remains. In 2022, a city council member proposed naming a new street after the Institute, citing the site's historical significance. The motion was struck down by unanimous vote. One council member, off mic, was overheard saying, "We don't name the wound, we bury it." And yet, even as it is buried, even as files are lost, as names fade from ledgers and faces blur in photographs, the twin shapes persist, not just as ghosts, not even as memories, but as an instruction never fully understood, repeated over and over by a place that learned how to mirror, but not how to forget. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.